Hi, and welcome to the Your Story Studios podcast, a podcast where we talk about all things content creation. And today we have Henry, and today we are talking about gear.
We love gear.
We love gear. So, Henry, tell me all about your gear journey.
So, I think the first camera I ever got was a DJI Mavic Pro. Which interesting choice of first camera, I suppose you could say. But the first actual real camera I got was a Sony A6000 mirrorless camera. And I think that shot, I think it was HD only. That was particular. The bitrate was pretty low. So even though some of these cameras I'll probably talk about, so there was an A6300 that I bought afterwards, even though it shot 4K, the quality of the 4K was not good. They're not all even, as you probably know by now. Yeah, so I think I got the A6000 first. I had that for a long time just with the kit lens. So that was a 16 to 50, I think, on an APS-C. So probably around a 24-ish to a 75, I think, on a full frame. And then, so I had both of those for a while. I ended up buying a second one and I just used both of them. And yeah, they were fine. They did the job for a long time. Eventually I upgraded to the GH5. And that was phenomenal. That was great. That was a huge upgrade. That was 8-bit color to 10-bit color. Had better recording options. Yes, it was a micro 4/3, so the sensor size was smaller, but with Sigma 18-35, as almost everyone's used at this point, or at some point in their journey, it was really nice. And I think it was a really good corporate camera. I still recommend it today. It's ridiculously cheap for what it is, but it is micro 4/3, and that's probably the only thing that steers me away from, I guess, those cameras at the moment. Yeah, so I bought that. And then afterwards, I joined a production company. At the time when I joined, we had 2 Sony A7 IIIs and an FS5. And then we were shooting with Ninja Atomos monitors. One was the Ninja, one was I can't remember what the other one was, but there was 2. And they were, so pretty much we were recording the 8-bit cameras, but we were recording to the monitors. So we were getting ProRes 10-bit. So it was nice images, worked really well. But then eventually we were like, hey, we've got to charge monitors. We've got to hold ProRes, which is like a huge file size. We've got to do all this stuff. And it just became a hassle. So they actually sold the 2 A7 IIIs and the FS5. We bought an FX6 and an FX3. And that I used for years. So I used that for, I think, almost 2 years at that production company. During that time, I also bought my own A7 III because I found it really cheap. Bought a couple primes with that as well. And then I bought a Blackmagic camera after that. So I bought the 6K Pro, sold my GH5, sold a bunch of old cameras for that. And that I still carry with me to this day. And it's a really nice camera. I love the image out of it. It's beautiful. But anyway, when I decided to leave the company, I was like, okay, do I get like an Ursa and pair that with Blackmagic, or do I get a Sony, like an FX6, and pair that with an A7 III that I've got? So I kind of have 2 paths that I could take, and I ended up going with the camera I now have, which is the FX6, and I've got years of experience with it. I love that camera, and it just fit my workflow. Yes, it was probably more expensive upfront, having to get lenses as well for it, and media, and all this other stuff. But I think the experience I had with it, plus a bunch of other features it has, which happy to talk about. I think, that's what drew me to that camera. So a lot of cameras to go over, but majority of I think I've pretty much had a camera or used a bunch of cameras in every brand except for Canon, I think.
Really?
Yes. I've never owned or primarily used a Canon camera. I don't even think I've shot on any Canon cameras.
Why?
I just haven't been in the kind of area to do so. I think back in Bendigo, which is again where I was from, so central Victoria, bigger town, I suppose. We did have like a small camera shop, but there wasn't rental places. Like I couldn't just go and try this camera, I suppose. And a couple of friends did have, I think someone I knew had an R6. There was a bunch of people that had Nikons as well, or Nikons, whichever way you want to say it. But yeah, I just never kind of went in that direction, I suppose. Every other brand I've pretty much tried and have decent amount of experience with, but just not Canon. But that said, I have edited Canon footage before, and I like it. It's great.
Yeah, the Canon colors.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's go back. You mentioned that you got the Blackmagic 6K Pro. Why did you land on that camera?
So at that time, I don't think I had decided I was going to move to Melbourne. So I was still with that production company. Love the FX6, love the FX3, but I think I saw a lot of the, results from the Blackmagic. I wanted to test out RAW. I wanted to test out an APS-C camera again. And I think the 6K also kind of intrigued me because it's higher resolution. And I think I just wanted to try a different sort of camera. And that particular one, probably more of a cinema camera approach. At that time, I was probably leaning more towards, I want to learn all about lighting and cinematography and like really dive into more the DP kind of route, I suppose, rather than like a corporate video producer. Yeah, it was really good because it taught me a lot. It was manual, obviously compared to the FX6 where it's like all auto, very run and gun. It's very good at like moving fast paced and just having everything built in. And the image is really nice out of it as well. Yeah, it kind of slowed me down, made me think a bit more. Unfortunately, I haven't used it as much as I would liked. But at the same time, I can't really sell it for what I think it's worth. And I like to have it around because I think for me, it's going to be a tool for the next couple of years where I kind of use it for more spec projects where, again, I still think it has better image than the FX6. Not by a huge margin, definitely not. But it's a nicer camera to kind of shoot, I guess, high quality projects. It's a different approach than the FX6 where I'm slowing down, I'm stopping, getting this frame, probably more tripod, manual focus, not moving, no gimbal kind of stuff, just very old school, I guess, in that regard. So yeah, I've still got that. And I bought it mainly just because I was like, hey, I want a cinema camera that's a bit older school that I can mess around with. And at the time I had the glass from my GH5, which was all APS-C lenses. So all I needed to get was a body and I had everything pretty much, and media, of course.
Yeah. And what mount does that one have? Is it EF? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the lenses that you had, were they?
Sigma 18-35, which again, there's one of the nicest lenses. It's just got this look to it. And I still think the Blackmagic has this look to it, which is probably stereotypical to say, but it just looks different. And I think it makes me think about it differently. But that, and I have a Tokina 11-16. So they're both APS-C lenses. So if you times it, I think it's a 1.6 on the Blackmagic from memory, roughly. And those are the two that I use. And I also have a vintage Helios 58mm. And yeah, it's got a fun kind of effect. But again, on the Blackmagic, that's also almost a 100mm. So it's pretty big gap between the Sigma and the Helios.
Yeah, I find when I've seen the Helios stuff, the bokeh, it's a little too swirly for me. It's definitely got a look.
It's got a look. And I think I agree. I've got to use it a little bit more. I bought a Sony E-mount recently for it to adapt it to. So I'm going to have to use it more on full frame a bit more because that's where you get the really crazy swirl. But on the Blackmagic, it's tricky because it's getting closer to that telephoto end because it's got that crop factor. So it's kind of harder to get the swirl happening because you're just so punched in. The background is so kind of out of focus. So yeah.
Let's now go to the FX6. Mm-hmm. Why are you using the FX6?
I think it was definitely comfort. I came from the FX6, but I still think even if I hadn't have had that camera before, I would have bought it. And it's just, I think it's the closest thing to the perfect corporate camera, especially for the work that I do. I'm not doing any broadcast, so I don't need like FX9 for interlaced or to use Super 35 lenses. It does have its flaws, obviously, but
what are they?
The audio is a flaw, but I think when I talk to a lot of people about it, I feel like
user error.
I would maybe I wouldn't say that to people, but I do think that you can work around them really easily. Like as an example, you don't have audio, you got to put it on a gimbal, put a time code on it, and boom. Like, you know what I mean?
Why wouldn't you have, for people that don't use the FX6, why would you not have audio if you put the FX6, just the camera body, on a gimbal?
So for the people that don't have an FX6, the FX6, any audio inputs at all in the camera are in the handle. So as soon as you take the handle off, you have no audio inputs. You have the scratch mic built into the body, but good luck getting any sort of thing with that, especially if you're far away, you're not going to get any sort of audio. Yes, so as soon as you take it off, you have no audio. I do say to a lot of people though, I think the camera is close enough to the perfect camera, and those little quirks like that, again, it has time code. And in those professional settings, I think people should have a good idea, like they should be using things like that if they need to. And if it didn't have time code, that would be obviously a much worse option. So yes, I think it's just the perfect kind of almost perfect call for camera.
Yeah. If you could improve the FX6, what would you do off the top of your head?
I don't know. There's plenty of different things you could do. I think the first thing would just be putting audio on the body. I say like we can work around it, but just having a 3.5mm would also just make life very easy.
Yeah, I've heard people say even just a 3.5mm, because the FX9, it has XLR inputs in the body. So you can take the handle off and still have the ability to plug it into the body. My Panasonic Eva 1 had inputs directly into the body, so I never had to worry about like taking the handle off and then losing those audio inputs, which is good. If I was to improve the FX6, maybe the first thing I would do would be improve the thumbnail or the media playback, because it's horrendous.
It's terrible.
If you do a long interview with someone, with a client, and then they say, "Oh, can we just go back to that part?" It's like, no.
Yep.
Or like you can be fumbling around with it. It just takes forever to find that one part.
Yeah.
It would be much nicer. I think the Blackmagics, when you play them back, you can just touch and then go on the timeline to where you want. Nah, not on the FX6. Can't do that. You got to be going forward 2 times, 4 times. I think you can go faster, but yeah, it's a bit of a nightmare.
It's no good. I trying to explain that to a client on Saturday night, and they're like, "Well, you can't just like get to this point." No,
So simple.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
Oh, and we're paying you how much to do this? Yeah, it's a bit frustrating.
Yes, absolutely.
Are there any other things with the FX6 that kind of grind your gears?
I don't think so. I mean, IBIS would be nice, but
Yeah,
I have
sure.
seen IBIS in like the Brano, and I was like, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference.
Oh,
And by
okay.
like it does make a difference, but I think like and it depends on how you're using your FX6. But like I remember at my previous place, we had it stripped down a lot. And we were running a 24 to 105, and that had image stabilization. And using that in a really light setup is nice, and having the option to do that. I've got mine quite heavy, like heavier, I say. There's definitely heavier FX6 setups, but it's a nice balance between them, so that gets rid of most of the shakes anyway. But yeah, like I wasn't super impressed with the Brano's IBIS, and kind of I was like, well, if they have to compromise on other things to put IBIS in there, is it worth it, kind of thing. So, and at the same time, I think the reason why I was also drawn to the FX6 and why probably so many others are, because I see it everywhere in the industry, is just because you can go up and down the cinema line, like Sony cinema line, so easy. Like the FX3 solves most of those problems that the FX6 has, where it's like you've got like audio in the body. You have IBIS built in. It's a smaller form factor. So if you need to be a little bit more, less noticed by people, you can. And then you've also got the FX9, which is great for like broadcast or using Super 35 stuff. And it's even just got a nicer image just out of the gate, I suppose. Not much, but a little bit. So I think the main kind of draw to the FX6 is just being able to use the different cameras, even the FX30, for different work cases, and matching all those cameras really easily as well, compared to some of Canon's lineup that I look at and I'm like, oh, I think like C400 looks like a great camera, but not having kind of the infrastructure around that camera, I think is why a lot more people are drawn to Sony.
Yeah, that was one of the initial things that put me over the line to go Sony, because when I was at that fork in the road, I was with Panasonic. I had the Panasonic Eva 1, and my B camera was the Panasonic S1. And they were great cameras, but the autofocus was annoying, and there was a few other things. So I was looking at Sony, the FX6, or Canon, the C70. And I ended up going with Sony because it pretty much solved a lot of my problems, and then it had that infrastructure around it, especially with the lenses. So if I was going with the Canon path at that time, I'd get a C70, which was a Super 35 sensor, and then I'd get maybe like an R6 or an R5, which was a full frame camera. And then I'd have to either look at getting different lenses, or I'd constantly be dealing with the crop factor and all that kind of stuff. And it was just one extra thing I didn't want to have to worry about. And it just made so much more sense with what Sony had. And one of the things that I like about Sony is it's got the multi-interface shoe input, I guess, in the handle. So you have to have the handle on the FX6. But it's all those MI shoes are also in the A7S3, in the A7R5, 2 cameras I also own. It's also in the FX30, which is over here as well. I think it's in the FX30.
I believe so.
Yeah. And they're on all these cameras, and I've also got the dual channel receiver, and then I've also got 2 Sony transmitters, so with lav mics, and then I've also got an XLR transmitter as well, so I can plug it into a shotgun mic and I have wireless audio that way. All these things that are all Sony branded and work with the Sony lineup just makes my job so much easier when I'm doing those fast-paced run and gun things. You mentioned before, like going up and down the cinema line. If you've got an FX6 and it's all rigged out and built up yes, it looks impressive to clients, but sometimes it's not the most nimble thing to have to get the shot, and you need to get the shot. So case in point, I had a shoot yesterday where I needed to go up and down flights of stairs and get interviews with people in a kitchen, and then people doing an event as well. And I had to move around everywhere. If I had my FX6, it would have been a lot harder because I use a Cine saddle as well to get stable shots, which is great. I love using my Cine saddle. A lot of people see the price tag and go, oh no, I'm not spending that on an overglorified gym bag with a pillow in it. I'll just do that. But I've invested in it, and I used it basically on most of my shoots that I do. And if I was doing that, it would have been very hard to get around where I needed to be. So I just used my A7R5 with the receiver in it, the wireless receiver. And then I had a producer with me who was asking people questions, and they just used a Rode NTG3 with the XLR input or XLR transmitter in it. And then they used that as the microphone, and I had a big fluffy over it as well. Not that there was wind inside, but just kind of protected the microphone a little bit as well. And that worked well, I felt. I haven't heard it. That was for an agency, so I haven't heard any feedback yet. They're only just getting the video, or they're only getting the footage right now as we speak. So who knows? But I was happy with how it all turned out. And I remember just thinking, oh, well, it was quite useful to have those two types of cameras, being able to be nimble and quick with a small form factor camera, as opposed to my big rigged out FX6 on a tripod. Also, because we were going around everywhere, I didn't really have a lighting solution as well. So it was all natural lighting. But I did confirm with the client before shooting. I said, well, I can do the nice polished on a tripod, light, all that kind of stuff. Or I can do a bit more run and gun, natural looking. What do you prefer? And they said, let's go the natural look. So they signed off on it.
Perfect.
Right? We'll go with that. Yeah, we'll go with that. So that's one of the things I love about Sony. It's so versatile for these types of videos that I find myself doing, and you find yourself doing as well. With that said, is there any other kind of camera that you would prefer to be? Oh, well, if you could dream and just use any other camera right now, what would it be? Or would you just say, you know what? The FX6, as you said before, is near enough to being the perfect camera for what you're finding yourself doing right now?
I think the FX, there's no other camera I'm really drawn to. And even if they brought out an FX6 Mark II, it would be I think it's going to be tough to get a lot of people to switch over because the current one is so good. And the reason why I also say that is I didn't use it heaps, to be very clear, but like coming from like an FS5 and an A7 III setup where you have the A7 IIIs, which are full frame, and then the FS5, which is like crop censored. And even with a speed booster and things like that, it was that similar thing that you were talking about with the C70 and an R5. It's like, I've got to think about, okay, what's this lens on this camera and this and this. So I think that was probably, I just think the FX6 is still such a phenomenal camera. I think the main issue that I have currently with the FX6, but it's also just not meant for it. And again, I would probably pick up an FX3 or an A7S III is if you want to do vertical content, like specific for vertical, because with the FX6, yes, there's vertical mounts, but like it's not meant for vertical shooting. It's a landscape camera. It's supposed to be, that's how it was kind of designed for. And maybe having something like OpenGate would help. But again, I don't know if that would help with this particular camera. So I'm not complaining. I think, they all have different tools for different jobs. And I think the FX6 is one of the perfect tools for corporate stuff, at least.
Yeah, awesome. You've just opened up a can of worms. So vertical content, why do we need to turn the camera that way for vertical content? Why would you do it? Why would you turn it that way as opposed to just shooting it landscape in, say, 4K and then cropping it to a 1080 the HD resolution, but 9:16.
Majority of content I do, that is what we do. And it's just, if they want landscape and they want portrait, it makes sense to shoot at landscape because cropping landscape out of a portrait is a lot worse than doing it the other way around. But that said, I think for me, it comes down to like when you crop in, you have to be that much further away. And that means with wide lenses, you have to go even wider. And I don't like going wider than 24mm for most things, unless I'm shooting something which needs a wider lens intentionally. But for most things, I like 24. I think it's just a nice thing. Maybe 20, but again, I don't have a lens that goes to 20 at the moment that I need to. So for me, I think turning it sideways, you don't have to crop. So therefore you know exactly what it looks like. Yes, you can put grid lines up, but also the lens characteristics like the bokeh are actually what they would be. So you're not cropping and don't have to go back, which means that you're further away from the subject, which means that you're not going to have as much kind of separation from the background because then you have to separate them further. So pretty much it actually changes what the look actually looks like. So when you shoot it vertically, I just think shooting it vertically also makes it so much simpler in the edit because you have something that's already done. And I think the main reason for me is just, wide lenses. It's like I have to shoot wider. And if you're shooting on 75, the distance you got to go back to get it to crop for socials is like really tight. And you could just say, just zoom out. But if you want that specific compression, having it vertically is a lot easier to kind of mount it. So for me, I think that makes more sense. But again, I think like using something like a mirrorless camera for that makes a lot of sense because it's very easy to do as well.
Yeah, I found there was a period in my life when I was doing social stuff for a client and I would shoot it vertical and then I was shooting it for a purpose. I was shooting it for reels. Great. But then in the future, there was another video that came up. Oh, it would have really been good to have or to be able to use that content in this video, which is not a reel, or it could be a reel, but its main purpose is to be a YouTube video or a video that is on the client's website. And from that point onwards, I've always just shot 4K and then done the HD vertical orientation. So what would you say to that? Am I doing the right thing, or is it like, hey, Nathan, you do you?
No, I think that's still smart. I think for most client projects, I'm still shooting landscape because it makes sense. Like if they want it for something else, then we've got it like that. Again, I think that's one thing that I do look at. I know some of Panasonic's cameras, they have that kind of wider. I know, like I think the S1H. I can't remember. I think the GH7 things do as well, but they've got more of a square kind of readout from the sensor.
Yeah, open gate.
Yeah, I would just love for more cameras to get that. Just it's not something that I think is a deal breaker, but I do think for social content means that we can crop for landscape and portrait without sacrificing on punching into something again. But I totally agree. I do think that for most client projects, it makes sense to just shoot landscape and crop in later because they're also not going to notice the difference in terms of what I was talking about before. But at the same time, there's so much content that is still being consumed on a landscape level. And I think a lot of landscape videos often they're longer videos as well, which means that they require more content. And then therefore, the more content that you've captured in landscape, the more you can fill that out. Whereas social content, you can crop in a lot easier and just get shots like that. So I think what you're doing is fantastic. I think for me, maybe it's because when I was making a lot of social content, I just like shooting it vertically made so much more sense. But I do think that when it comes to client work, it's shoot landscape, cut portrait. So
I think thank you. I think that's probably a pretty good general rule. Just learn from my mistakes. And also with your Sony FX6, talk me through the lenses that you're currently using.
Yep. So when I picked up the camera, I picked up the 24-70 G Master Mark II, and I picked up the 7200 F4 macro, which is the Mark II version. So those are the two, and I also have a 24mm prime, so that's the G Master prime. I have a 55mm prime, which interesting, and then I've got an 85mm prime as well. So those are the main lenses that I use. If I need other things, I'll often rent them.
Yeah, and talk me through why you would use each of those lenses.
So the 24-70 is like almost always on my camera. I love that lens. I think it's just, yes, it's expensive, but I found it to be worth it, and I have not been disappointed in kind of how it looks or performs or anything like that. The 70, so I use that majority of the time. 70-200 I've been picking up more recently, so some conference work, but also just some shots where we want to get closer. I haven't used the macro capabilities that much, but I didn't think I would. And I think that's why I wanted to get the macro version. Number one, the biggest reason why I got that particular lens is it's smaller than the 2.8 version and cheaper. But the smallness actually means that I can fit it in a sling bag, whereas the old 7200s I couldn't, and the new 2.8 I also can't. So the actual compact size, even though it extends, that's the main reason why I actually got it. And then the macro was also a bonus because I'm like, well, I don't have to rent out a macro lens for that. And yes, a prime macro has a lower aperture and you need quite a lot of light with it macro, but for the most part, it's been really, really nice and a great lens as well. I think the 24 I've used heaps for social content. It's just a perfect especially when you kind of turn it vertical. It's just a really nice kind of focal length without distorting too much. The 55 is also nice. The 85 I'd probably use the least. But yeah, I don't find myself needing to go wider than 24 pretty much ever. And having those two zoom lenses for most shoots just means that I have 24 to 200 mil covered. And if I really need further reach, then you could just use clear image zoom.
Yeah.
And going with all Sony means that you can also use the breathing compensation, which is a nice feature. And then if you need that little bit, I guess, wider frame, you can also turn it off for some shots.
Yeah, because even though you're spending a lot of money on these G Master lenses, they're photo lenses first. And if you're doing video and you've got that real shallow depth of field, there's that lens breathing, which can be quite distracting. So having lens breathing compensation in a lot of the Sony cameras these days is, essential for all these super expensive lenses. I remember when I first came over to Sony and found out that there was all this lens breathing in their flagship top of the range lenses, I was like, why? Oh, I'm just going to have to wait for them to bring out the next version, which will correct it. But to my surprise, Sony figured out, oh no, we can just update firmware and do some magic that way. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. So that's one of the things I like about Sony is that they're solving problems that we're finding and not necessarily making us buy new lenses, but they do kind of make us buy new cameras.
Yeah, they definitely do.
Yeah. And also one of the things, it's not the most exciting thing, but powering our cameras is essential to get the shot. How are you powering your setups?
So at my previous place, we just used the standard BPU batteries which come with the camera. So they're just the standard FX6 batteries. But when I got mine, I actually bought a cage and a V-mount. The reason why is I wanted to be able to power more than just the camera. And also, so pretty much my monitor that I have on the camera as well, that's powered through the V-mount. If I have a wireless receiver, I can also plug that all into the V-mount. And then when I come home, I'm using 3 things on set, but I only have to charge the one battery as well. And by buying V-mounts as well, I've been able to use them for lights. So I can use them for more than just the camera. When I go to another camera, I can also use the same V-mounts if I go to Canon, to Panasonic, to any other manufacturer. And yes, you got to rig it out a little bit, but it's also nice with the FX6 because the extra weight is kind of nice. And I could take it away and just use a BPU for some things as well. But yeah, I think V-mounts it's streamlined a lot of the process, especially a lot of the ones that I got a USB-C, which means that when I'm traveling, I just need to bring a USB-C charger and everything is all charged. So yeah, V-mounts are a small thing. And again, as you said, kind of a bit of a boring topic. But I think once you actually start getting things like this, where you come home and I plug in one battery instead of 4 different types of batteries for the one thing, you get a lot more excited because your life gets a lot easier and then you can just go and do other stuff instead of being like, okay, is this one all charged? Yep, let's plug that one in. So yeah.
And what kind of V-Lock batteries are you using?
So I picked up just the small rig VB99s. I am interested in the 212, but the main reason I picked up the 99 so that I can fly with a couple if I want to, which is really nice. And I also think at the time they were one of the only people on the market with USB-C. There's a lot more manufacturers now that actually have them. And I think they brought out the SE and the Pro versions of what I've got, but I've just got the original standard versions. And everyone that I've talked to and in my own experience have just been easy, good. I don't think they're the cheapest. I don't think they're the most expensive. They're kind of in the middle, I think, from memory. But they just work well. They do the job. Build quality isn't crazy. They're not metal. They're plastic. But they're also not something that I'd want to drop anyway. So
yeah. For me personally, I use V-mounts as well. I use the Sony FX6 and I've got the tilter cage and the adapter and all that, so I can put the V-Lock on that way. And I use the Core SWX batteries and I use the 150 watt hour because I have no interest in flying right now. In this age and stage of my life that I'm in right now, I'm not leaving home for long periods of time. So I'm not flying off and doing all that kind of stuff. I'm very much local within Melbourne, within state lines, pretty much. Like the furthest, I did a shoot out in Seymour the other week. So that's about 2 hours outside of or away from where we are currently recording in Beaconsfield, Melbourne, Australia. So I don't go too far. So that's why I'm happy to have those high capacity batteries because as you mentioned, if you have V-Lock batteries that are over 100, so 99 is a nice number.
Yep.
You can't fly with those. So that's just a pro tip for people that might be getting into the V-Lock ecosystem. But what I really like about those batteries, the Core SWX ones, is they've got a whole bunch of different types, but the ones that I've got in particular have a percentage on a screen and then also a runtime or an estimated runtime of how much longer the battery should last. And I've found they can be quite reliable on my Sony FX6, but I was on a shoot this past week and I had one of the batteries powering my Aperture 60X. It had about 20% left on the battery. Said it did. But the 60X was saying, nah, bro, flash, you've got 1 minute left. And the producer that I was with, they were going to swap the battery over. And I said, nah, let's see what happens. It says it's got 20% left. Let's see what happens. And then we were doing interviews, and then I think it was maybe, they weren't mission critical interviews as well. So if the light went out, that's fine. We can just swap it over. So I just wanted to see if it would burn out before the battery said it would, and it did. So it wasn't 100% accurate, which I can kind of forgive. But I have found that with the FX6, it has been a lot more reliable. So, and it will go down past that 20% as well. So yeah, I was kind of interested. Or it was interesting to see that the light just turned off when it still said that it had 20% left. So kind of concerning, but also it's a known problem. So I'll just avoid that in the future. But you mentioned build quality before. The build quality I find with the Core SWX, they're quite good. They feel quite robust. However, I've broken the screen on one of my 3 150 watt hour batteries. I had it on the back of my FX6 and I tapped it against a steel stair rail. And by tap, I mean, and there was probably a little bit more force than a tap. I was just moving it and just hit it a little bit. And then I looked at it and I could see that it's, I don't know, like a crystal's LCD display or whatever, I'm guessing. Oh no, I don't make the batteries. I just use them. And it's, broken now. So it's basically eliminated the main reason that I bought those more expensive batteries as well. You can get cheaper 150 watt hour batteries, but I spent more to get that screen that gave me the percentage and also the estimated runtime as well. So that was a little bit frustrating. So I can still use the battery, but the main reason that I got those batteries is now taken away. With that battery as well, it's got D-tap out, which is great, which helps me power my monitor on my rig. And also it does have USB-A out. It doesn't have USB-C. This was pre-USB-C. But the updated version of the Core SWX batteries does have USB-C.
Yes.
So I've looked at them and gone, do I need that one? Or do I just get what I've already got at a cheaper price, because they are cheaper now because the new things come out and everyone wants the new thing. But do I need the new thing? I want the new thing.
Yeah, of course.
But I don't necessarily need the new thing.
Exactly.
So batteries, they're not the most exciting thing to talk about, but they are essential. And it's always good to find something that helps us get the shot. Speaking of things that help us get the shot, media. Another thing that isn't super interesting, but one thing to note about the FX6 is that it's got dual cards, and not only is it dual card slots where you can either do relay record, so record from one, and then once that fills up, goes on to the next one. You can also do dual recording, so you've got an instant backup of whatever you're recording. But the cool thing about these Sony cameras, or a lot of them these days, is you can use CF Express Type A cards or SD cards, even the fast, or especially the fast V90 cards as well. And that's one cool thing, one cool innovation that I've seen from Sony that I was like, oh, great. Because you don't have to choose just that one type of really expensive card. And CF Express Type A cards were quite expensive. They still are relatively, but there are other options now. When the FX6 first came out, there was only Sony. And then other third party eventually started coming to the party, and they were a little bit cheaper. And now I've seen a few other cards that are significantly more cheaper, But then when you see that smaller price, that cheaper price, you're like, how good are they? So you go straight to YouTube, look for reviews, or go on Amazon and look for reviews. And I've seen, I think they're called Pergear. And I've only heard good things. I think there might have been one disgruntled Amazon review, but I have seen YouTube videos that have said, and long-term ones as well.
Yeah.
And they made a point that this is a long-term review. Like I think they was sent the card, and then the company was saying, hey, where's that review?
Yes.
It's like, I've got to test it out, mate.
Yeah.
Because if it fails or whatever, if you're saying these cards are great, they don't fail, and then a week later after you've posted that video and influenced a lot of people to buy these cards and they start failing, that's not good.
Definitely not.
So with all that said, what cards do you use?
I actually picked up the Angelbird 1 terabyte cards before they were discontinued. They actually, I haven't done a huge deep dive, but I haven't found a reason why they discontinued them. They didn't say anything in particular.
I didn't know they were discontinued.
Yeah.
Okay.
I went to go buy some more the other day, and I was like, they're not there. But anyway, I picked them up. They were expensive cards because they're a terabyte each, which is a lot of media on one card. But in terms of the price per gigabyte to get a terabyte worth of SD cards, they're a lot cheaper. So overall, they're more expensive to buy up front, but they're cheaper in terms of capacity, I suppose, per dollar. But yeah, I use those. And the reason why I've also got some SD cards as well, some V90 Angelbird 128 gigabyte ones. They work great as well. And I'll use SD cards if I'm offloading media and I don't have a card with me. But the 1 terabyte ones are what I use all the time. I dual record to both of them because it's a terabyte. And they're great. They transfer really fast. I've never had any problems with media with them. And they're a terabyte, which also helps when I'm shooting because I'm not thinking about media at all. I'm like, I never ever am running out of card space. But the one thing I have had an issue with, and this is not the Angelbird's problem, this is actually a Sony problem, is Sony has a limit on the amount of files you can record to the cards. Even if the cards can hold more, they say, no, you can't, not allowed.
And do you know what that number is? Because I've heard a couple of
330 something, I think. From memory. Again, I'd have to look it up, but every time I get close to the 300 mark, I'm like, okay, I'm close. It's only happened to me once, and the reason why that happened was because I was storing previous projects on there. Because I'm like, I've got a terabyte, I don't need to wipe them. And then ever since then, I've been like, no, I'm wiping them, backing them up, wiping them, moving on from there. So yeah, it just helps when you rock up to a shoot and you're like, yep, I have 500 minutes of 4K 25 per card. I'm like, worst case, I just not do a record and I just have 1,000 minutes. It's like, I don't think I'm going to go through that in a single day. So it just removes one of those things I have to think about during shooting. Just makes it a lot easier. As you know, you got to think about frame rates, resolutions, white balances, all this other stuff. It's like, I don't want to have to think about media as well. Similar to the battery situation where it's like, I don't want to have to be swapping a battery more often than I do have to. So maybe I'll have to get some 150 watt hour batteries.
Yeah, if you're not flying, why not?
That's very
or even
true.
bigger. Because
I think I have enough for flying now, I might as well just get some for home. So
yeah, 'cause 150, that's good. I've also got, I think, a 190 something, but I got that secondhand, and this is a word of warning. When you get secondhand batteries, they don't necessarily last as long as you want them to. So right now, it still charges, but the capacity or the percentage and the time and all that, it's frozen, and it just says it's always 91%.
Oh wow,
charged. No, it's not.
Yeah,
I've had it on this light for an hour, and it's probably a lot lower than that.
Yeah.
Buy batteries new, and cards probably buy new as well.
Probably new.
Excellent. All right, Henry, thank you very much for coming on today and talking to us all about your gear.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.